Dad, Urea Burden.
Those were the exact words my own daughter screamed at me on my 75th birthday, right in front of all the guests in my living room. There I stood, holding the birthday cake I had bought for myself because no one else remembered, watching my 28-year-old daughter roll her eyes at me like I was some annoying stranger who had crashed her party. She was wearing a $300 dress I had paid for, carrying a designer purse I had bought her last month, complaining about how I was embarrassing her friends by asking if anyone wanted coffee. For 28 years, I had quietly been her financial safety net: college tuition, car payments, rent, credit card bills, vacations, emergency funds, all while she believed I was just a lonely old widower living on Social Security and pension. She had no idea that the man she just called a burden had been covering her $4,000 monthly credit card bill for the past 3 years without saying a word. But that night, as I sat alone in my kitchen listening to her laugh with her friends about dealing with difficult elderly parents, I made one simple phone call that would change everything between us forever. I canceled her credit card, and what happened next taught her the most valuable lesson about gratitude she would ever learn. My name is Gene Patterson, and before I tell you how that one phone call completely transformed our relationship forever, subscribe and share this story with someone who believes tough love sometimes means setting boundaries, because what happened next will surprise you. It was 11:47 p.m. when I finally walked into my home office, the room Sarah had never bothered to explore. She always assumed it was just where her boring old dad paid bills and watched YouTube videos about woodworking. If she had ever stepped inside, she might have noticed the 3 monitors displaying real-time stock portfolios, the filing cabinets filled with property deeds, or the framed certificate for my 40-year career as a financial advisor before retirement. But Sarah saw only what she wanted to see: a lonely widower who needed her occasional visits out of pity. The house felt different now, hollow in ways that had nothing to do with emptiness. I could still hear echoes of her voice. "God, Dad, you're so embarrassing."
My friends think you're weird.
The birthday cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, 75 candles melted into colorful wax puddles. I had been foolish enough to think this year might be different, that maybe she had matured enough to spend one evening focused on someone other than herself. Instead, she had spent 2 hours complaining about her job, her boyfriend, her rent, while simultaneously booking a vacation to Miami on the Platinum card tucked in her designer wallet. I pulled out the manila folder I had been dreading to open. Sarah, Monthly Statements, was written in my careful handwriting across the tab. Inside, a chronicle of financial entitlement that would have shocked even me if I hadn't been living it month by month. January, $4,200.
February, $3,800.
March, $5,100. That was the month she needed the new MacBook for her graphic design side hustle that lasted exactly 3 weeks. April brought the $2,400 shopping spree because she deserved something nice after a bad day at work. By October, she was averaging $4,000 monthly, treating my money like an infinite resource that magically refilled itself. The credit card company loved us. To them, we were model customers, always paying on time, never missing a payment, steadily increasing our spending limits. What they didn't know was that only one of us knew where the money actually came from. My hands were steadier than I expected as I dialed the customer service number.
3 rings. American Express Platinum Services. This is Jennifer speaking.
How may I provide excellent service tonight? The irony wasn't lost on me. Even at midnight, someone was available to help wealthy customers manage their money. I need to remove an authorized user from my account, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Account ending in 4827.
Typing sounds, a brief pause.
I see here that Sarah Patterson has been an authorized user for, wow, 8 years. May I ask if there's been any fraudulent activity or concerns about security?
8 years.
My daughter had been spending my money freely for 8 years, ever since she graduated college and moved to the city. 8 years of thinking she was independent while I quietly covered everything from her emergency dental work to her friend's bachelorette party in Vegas. No fraud, I replied. The authorized user needs to learn financial independence. Remove her access immediately, please. Certainly, Mr. Patterson. I'll process that right now. The card will be deactivated within the hour, and she'll receive notification via email. Is there anything else I can help you with tonight? I looked around my office, at the investment statements showing 7 figures in carefully managed accounts, at the property documents for the 3 rental houses that generated steady income, at the life insurance policy that would ensure Sarah never actually wanted for anything important. She had called me a burden while sitting on a foundation I had spent decades building for her security. That's everything, I told Jennifer. Thank you. Tomorrow, Sarah would learn what her father was actually worth. And more importantly, she would discover what she was worth without him. Sarah Elizabeth Patterson was born with advantages she never recognized and opportunities she took for granted. At 28, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that opened doors and the sharp tongue that often slammed them shut. She worked part-time at a trendy marketing agency downtown, a job she had landed not through her mediocre portfolio but through a connection I had quietly arranged with a former client. Her Instagram feed told the story of a successful young professional living her best life in the city: designer brunches, rooftop cocktails, weekend getaways to Napa Valley. What it didn't show was the financial reality behind the lifestyle. Every single experience was subsidized by a father she barely tolerated. Sarah lived in a converted loft in the Arts District, a space she loved to show off to friends as proof of her independence. "I found this place all by myself," she would brag, conveniently forgetting that I had co-signed the lease and covered the security deposit when her credit score wasn't quite good enough. The monthly rent of $2,800 strained her $3,200 salary, but somehow she never seemed worried about money. Bills had a magical way of getting paid, problems had a tendency to disappear, and credit limits mysteriously increased whenever she needed them. Her relationship with money was purely transactional. It existed to serve her immediate desires, and when it ran low, more would somehow appear. She drove a silver BMW that she claimed to have earned through hard work and smart saving, though she had never saved a dollar in her life. The car payments, insurance, maintenance, even the premium gas she insisted on using, all invisible line items in my monthly budget that she never questioned. When the transmission needed a $3,000 repair last spring, she called me in tears, not asking for help but simply expecting it. "Dad, my car broke down and I can't afford to fix it. What am I supposed to do?" The answer was always the same. I handled it quietly, and she moved on without a second thought. Her friends saw her as financially savvy, someone who had figured out how to live well in an expensive city on a modest salary. They asked for her advice on budgeting and investment, unaware that her secret was having a father who absorbed every financial shock before it could touch her carefully curated life. Sarah dispensed wisdom about living within your means, while spending roughly double her actual income every month. The cruelest irony was how she spoke about me to others. I had overheard phone conversations where she described me as sweet but kind of helpless, and still figuring out life after Mom died. To her circle, I was the stereotypical lonely widower who needed his daughter's occasional attention to feel useful. She painted herself as the dutiful daughter making sacrifices to spend time with her sad, aging father. In her version of our relationship, she was doing me the favor. The birthday incident wasn't an isolated outburst. It was the culmination of years of subtle disrespect that had grown bolder over time. She had started canceling our monthly dinners for work emergencies that turned out to be dates with whatever guy she was seeing. She screening my calls when she was out with friends, returning them days later with breezy explanations about being super busy. When I had minor surgery last year, she visited once, spent 20 minutes checking her phone, then left to meet friends for happy hour.
"You're fine, Dad. You don't need me overing over you."
But what stung most was how she spoke about my life, as though my 75 years had been a dress rehearsal for the real show of her existence. She referred to my career as some boring financial stuff, and my marriage to her mother as nice, I guess, for back then. My hobbies were cute, my concerns were silly, and my opinions were politely dismissed as outdated thinking from a different generation. Sarah had perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as filial duty. She knew exactly how to make me feel guilty for expecting basic respect, how to frame her selfishness as independence, and how to position herself as the victim whenever I dared to express disappointment. Tonight, for the first time in 8 years, that manipulation would stop working. Tonight, she would discover that burden and benefactor were two very different things. 3 weeks before my 75th birthday, I started planning what I hoped would be a perfect evening. Not perfect in the grand sense. I wasn't expecting a surprise party or elaborate celebrations, but perfect in the way that simple family moments used to be when Martha was alive. I wanted Sarah to see me not as the obligation she grudgingly fulfilled, but as her father who still had stories to tell and wisdom to share. The irony now seems almost cruel. I was orchestrating my own humiliation with the thoroughness of a military campaign. I spent hours at the grocery store, reading ingredient labels and selecting items for Sarah's favorite meal. She had always loved my chicken marsala, a recipe Martha had taught me during our early marriage when we were too poor to eat out but too in love to care. I bought organic chicken breasts, real marsala wine instead of the cooking wine I usually used, fresh mushrooms from the expensive section, and heavy cream that cost more than my entire lunch budget for a week. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending my own money to cook for someone who would later call me a burden for existing. I cleaned the house with the intensity of someone expecting a formal inspection. Every surface gleamed, every corner was vacuumed, every photograph was dusted and straightened. I arranged fresh flowers on the dining room table, white roses, Martha's favorite, which had become Sarah's favorite by extension. The good china came out of storage, plates that hadn't seen daylight since Martha's last birthday 4 years ago. I polished the silver candlesticks that had been my wedding gift to Martha, hoping the warm light might recreate some magic from the hundreds of family dinners we had shared at that same table. The guest list was pathetically small but carefully considered. I invited Mrs. Henderson from next door, who had been Martha's closest friend and always asked about Sarah with genuine interest. I called my brother Robert in Cleveland, hoping he might drive the 3 hours to celebrate with us. I even reached out to Sarah's college roommate Jenny, who had always been kind to me and seemed to actually enjoy our conversations. In my naive optimism, I imagined Sarah would appreciate the effort to bring together people who cared about both of us. Instead, she would later complain that I had ambushed her with boring old people when she was expecting a quiet family dinner. I spent an entire afternoon selecting the perfect birthday cake. The bakery downtown specialized in custom designs, and I wanted something that would make Sarah smile the way she used to when she was little. I settled on a chocolate layer cake with raspberry filling, her childhood favorite, decorated with elegant sugar flowers instead of the cartoon characters she had loved at age 7. The baker, a young woman about Sarah's age, seemed genuinely touched when I explained it was for my daughter's visit. "She's lucky to have a dad who pays attention to details like this," she said. If only she knew how those details would be received. The birthday gift had taken me months to choose. Sarah had mentioned wanting to take a photography class, one of her many passing interests that usually lasted about 6 weeks. I researched the best programs in the city, found a respected instructor who specialized in portrait photography, and prepaid for a 6-month course including all equipment and studio time. The enrollment confirmation was beautifully printed and placed in an elegant frame, tangible proof that I listened to her dreams, even the fleeting ones. I imagined her face lighting up when she realized I had taken her casual comment seriously enough to invest in her artistic ambitions. Instead, she would glance at it for exactly 3 seconds before setting it aside to check her phone. The evening's timeline was planned with embarrassing precision. I would greet guests at 6, serve appetizers and wine while Sarah got settled, present dinner at 7:30, and save the gift presentation for after dessert when everyone was relaxed and happy. I had even prepared conversation topics in advance, gentle questions about Sarah's work and social life that might encourage her to share something meaningful about her world. I practiced in the mirror, rehearsing how to ask about her photography interests without sounding like I was prying. The cruel truth was that I was planning an evening designed to celebrate someone who had stopped seeing me as worth celebrating years ago. Every detail I arranged with love would become evidence of my inadequacy in her eyes. Every gesture of care would be reframed as neediness. Every attempt to create connection would be interpreted as desperation. I was a man planning his own emotional execution, convinced that if I just tried hard enough, if I just got everything perfect enough, my daughter might remember why she used to love spending time with her dad. 3 weeks of hope and preparation would collapse in less than 3 minutes of her actual presence. The financial support began before Sarah even realized she needed it. During her senior year of college, when she called crying about her laptop dying 2 weeks before final exams, I didn't hesitate. While she panicked about losing her thesis and missing graduation, I was already online ordering a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro with expedited shipping. "Dad, I don't know how I'm going to afford a new computer," she sobbed into the phone. "Don't worry about it," I told her.
Focus on your studies.
The laptop arrived the next day with a note saying it was from the emergency student fund her college provided. She never questioned the coincidence or wondered why she was the only student who seemed to qualify for such generous assistance. That lie cost me $2,400 and my vacation to Colorado that year, but seeing her graduate with honors felt worth every penny. The pattern was established early and reinforced constantly. After graduation, when Sarah announced she was moving to the city to find herself artistically, I knew what that meant financially. Her entry-level job at a coffee shop paid barely enough for groceries, let alone rent in any neighborhood she would consider acceptable. I spent weeks researching apartments online, creating fake email accounts to inquire about places in her budget range, then mysteriously discovering that several landlords were willing to accept co-signers and reduced security deposits. Sarah thought she had incredible luck finding her first studio apartment. I thought I had incredible skill at invisible parenting. The coffee shop phase lasted 8 months before Sarah decided retail wasn't stimulating her creative energy. She quit on a Tuesday and called me that evening, not asking for money but casually mentioning that her rent was due Friday and she had about $300 to her name. By Wednesday morning, I had transferred $1,500 to her checking account. The bank slip showed it as a deposit reversal correction, technical language that obscured the fact that her father had just covered 6 weeks of living expenses while she job hunted. She found work at the marketing agency 2 weeks later, but never connected her survival period to any external help. Her first car purchase was a masterclass in financial manipulation disguised as independence. Sarah had saved exactly $2,000 for a down payment on a used Honda Civic, proud of her first major adult purchase. When we went to the dealership together, she fell in love with a BMW that cost 3 times her budget. "I wish I could afford something like that," she sighed, running her hands along the silver paint. The salesman, who had been briefed by my phone call an hour earlier, suddenly discovered financing options that seemed too good to be true. Sarah drove home in her dream car, convinced she had negotiated the deal of a lifetime. The reality was that I had prepaid 18 months of car payments and covered the insurance difference between a Honda and a BMW. She made her monthly payments religiously, never realizing they represented less than half the actual cost. Medical emergencies became routine exercises in creative accounting. When Sarah needed her wisdom teeth removed, a procedure her basic insurance wouldn't cover, I arranged for the oral surgeon to bill me directly while telling Sarah that her upgraded student coverage had kicked in retroactively. When she broke her ankle during a weekend ski trip, I paid the emergency room bills before she even knew they existed, ensuring her credit remained spotless. The hospital's financial counselor became skilled at explaining to Sarah how her excellent insurance coordination resulted in 0 out-of-pocket expenses. Vacations represented my most elaborate financial deceptions. Sarah's Instagram feed documented trips to Europe, weekend escapes to wine country, and spontaneous flights to visit friends in other cities. She attributed her travel lifestyle to smart budgeting and travel rewards points, unaware that I was monitoring her credit card statements and paying off vacation charges before they could accumulate interest. When she spent 2 weeks in Italy with college friends, posting photos of expensive restaurants and luxury hotels, I calculated that she had spent more in 14 days than I spent on entertainment in an entire year. The Italy trip alone cost me $4,800, money I had been saving for a new roof that I postponed for another year. Professional opportunities seemed to find Sarah with remarkable frequency. The unpaid internship at a prestigious design firm that somehow provided a living stipend. The freelance graphics projects that paid unusually well for a beginning artist. The photography workshop in New York that offered her a scholarship covering tuition and travel expenses. Behind each opportunity was my careful research, my phone calls to decision-makers, and my anonymous financial contributions that made Sarah's dreams affordable. She built her resume believing in her own exceptional luck and natural talent, never questioning why doors seemed to open so easily for her when her peers struggled with similar aspirations. The most painful sacrifice was watching her take credit for successes I had quietly purchased. When Sarah's freelance business started gaining clients, she attributed her growth to networking and talent, not knowing that 3 of her first major contracts came through my former colleagues who hired her as a favor to me. When she won a local design competition, she didn't know I had anonymously sponsored the contest specifically to create an opportunity for emerging artists like her. Her acceptance speech thanked hard work and determination, while I sat in the back row, proud of her talent but heartbroken by her ignorance of the foundation supporting her achievements. 28 years of these invisible interventions had created a daughter who believed herself entirely self-made while being entirely financially dependent. Tonight, she would discover what self-reliance actually meant. Martha Patterson died on a Tuesday morning in October 4 years ago, after a 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer that she faced with the same quiet dignity she had brought to everything else in her 47-year marriage. Her final weeks were spent in our bedroom, surrounded by flowers from the garden she could no longer tend and photographs of the family she wasn't ready to leave behind. The hospice nurse had warned me that the end was approaching, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of her final words or the promise that would define the rest of my relationship with our daughter. On her last coherent day, Martha gripped my hand with surprising strength and asked me to sit close enough that she could whisper directly into my ear. Her voice was barely audible, but her message was crystal clear. "Gene, promise me you'll take care of our Sarah. She's stronger than she knows, but she's going to need time to figure that out. Don't let her struggle the way we did when we were young. Make sure she has everything she needs to become the woman I know she can be." I promised immediately, desperately, the way you promise anything to someone you're about to lose forever. What I didn't understand then was how catastrophically I would misinterpret those loving words. Martha's definition of taking care and mine would prove to be fundamentally different, and by the time I realized my mistake, I had created exactly the opposite of what my wife had hoped for our daughter. Martha had grown up during the Depression, the youngest of 6 children in a family where new shoes were a Christmas miracle and college was an impossible dream. She worked her way through nursing school by cleaning office buildings at night, studying by flashlight in empty conference rooms when the janitor's closet was too dark. When we met in 1978, she was saving every penny to buy her own car because she refused to depend on anyone for transportation. Her idea of independence wasn't theoretical. It was survival skill born from necessity and strengthened by pride. She had wanted Sarah to have the opportunities she never had, but she also wanted Sarah to earn them with the same character that had defined her own life. In those final days, Martha shared memories I had never heard before. How proud she had been when she made her first car payment entirely from her own wages. How satisfied she felt when she could buy her mother a winter coat without having to choose between that and groceries. How important it had been to her that our early marriage was a partnership between equals, not a rescue mission where one person carried the other. "I want Sarah to feel that satisfaction," Martha whispered during one of our last conversations. "I want her to know what it feels like to solve her own problems and celebrate her own victories. Don't rob her of that feeling, Gene. Don't love her so much that you forget to let her grow." But grief has a way of distorting even the clearest instructions. After Martha's funeral, When Sarah broke down crying because she couldn't afford to take time off work to properly mourn her mother, my interpretation of taking care kicked into overdrive. I saw my daughter's tears and remembered Martha's words about not letting her struggle, so I quietly handled Sarah's bills for the month so she could grieve without financial pressure. When Sarah mentioned feeling overwhelmed by adult responsibilities while dealing with loss, I heard Martha's voice saying, "Make sure she has everything she needs." So I gradually began removing obstacles from Sarah's path entirely. Each financial intervention felt like honoring my wife's memory. Every problem I solved for Sarah seemed like fulfilling the sacred promise I had made at Martha's bedside. I convinced myself that Martha would be proud to see our daughter living free from the financial stress that had defined our own early years. What I failed to recognize was that Martha's struggles had been her education, and by eliminating Sarah's struggles, I was denying her the same education that had made her mother extraordinary. Martha had learned self-reliance through necessity. I was teaching Sarah dependence through generosity. Martha had developed character through overcoming obstacles. I was removing obstacles before Sarah even knew they existed. The woman who had worked night shifts to pay for her nursing degree would have been horrified to see her daughter take a paid-for car and expensive lifestyle for granted. But by the time I understood the difference between supporting someone and enabling them, the pattern was too deeply established to change easily. I had kept my promise to take care of Sarah, but I had failed to honor the spirit of what Martha really wanted, a daughter strong enough to take care of herself. Martha's death had left me desperate to maintain some connection to her through our child, and that desperation had blinded me to the difference between love and overprotection. Tonight, for the first time since making that bedside promise, I was going to start honoring what Martha actually meant rather than what my grief had convinced me she said. It was time to give Sarah the gift of struggle that her mother had always intended for her to receive. The erosion of respect didn't happen overnight. It accumulated like sediment, each small slight building upon the last until the foundation of our relationship had shifted completely without either of us acknowledging the damage. Looking back, I can trace the exact moment when Sarah stopped seeing me as her father and started viewing me as her personal inconvenience. It was 18 months after Martha's funeral, during what Sarah called her healing phase, when she first rolled her eyes at me in public. We were at the grocery store together, and I had asked the cashier if they offered senior discounts. Sarah physically cringed, stepped away from me, and later spent the entire car ride home explaining how embarrassing it was when I acted old in front of strangers. "Dad, you don't need to announce your age to everyone," she said, her voice carrying the condescending tone usually reserved for correcting small children. "It makes people uncomfortable." I apologized that day, confused about when saving money had become a social crime, but willing to modify my behavior if it made my daughter more comfortable being seen with me. That apology was my first mistake. It established that Sarah's comfort mattered more than my dignity, and she filed that lesson away for future use. Phone calls became exercises in scheduling around her social calendar. Our weekly Sunday dinners, a tradition Martha and I had maintained for decades, suddenly competed with brunch plans, yoga classes, and Netflix marathons that couldn't be interrupted. "Can we move it to Thursday?" became Sarah's standard response to any invitation, followed by, "Actually, this week is crazy. Can we just play it by ear?" Playing it by ear inevitably meant cancellation via text message, usually sent while I was already setting the table for two. Her reasons evolved from plausible to insulting with remarkable speed. First, it was legitimate work obligations and social commitments that I could understand and respect. Then it became headaches, fatigue, and vague mentions of needing some me time that felt like elaborate excuses. Finally, she stopped offering explanations altogether, simply writing, "Can't make it tonight, sorry," with a casual emoji that somehow made the rejection feel even more dismissive. I started cooking anyway, creating elaborate meals for myself while pretending I hadn't been hoping she would change her mind and show up at the last minute. The conversational dynamic shifted from dialogue to monologue, with Sarah treating our interactions like mandatory debriefings she had to endure rather than connections she wanted to maintain. She developed a habit of checking her phone every 30 seconds during our rare face-to-face visits, responding to texts while I was mid-sentence, taking calls without excusing herself from the table. "Sorry, Dad, this is important," she would say, stepping onto the porch for 20-minute conversations that were apparently more crucial than anything I might have to share. When she returned, she never asked where we had left off or acknowledged the interruption. The conversation simply resumed wherever her attention happened to land. Gift-giving occasions became opportunities for Sarah to express subtle disappointment in my choices and obvious disappointment in my budget. The photography course I had enrolled her in for Christmas was sweet, but not really practical right now. The vintage camera I found at an estate sale was nice, but not the brand professionals use. The framed prints of family photos were thoughtful, but I don't really have wall space in my apartment. Each gift was received with the kind of polite gratitude you might show a distant relative who had tried their best but missed the mark entirely. Meanwhile, her gifts to me became increasingly generic and obviously last-minute. Drugstore cologne still in the plastic bag, gift cards to restaurants I had never mentioned liking, books about coping with loss that felt more like homework assignments than thoughtful selections. The most painful degradation was how Sarah began speaking about me to others within my earshot, as though I had become invisible or irrelevant to conversations about my own life. During a dinner party I was hosting for her friends, I overheard her describing my retirement as kind of sad, actually, explaining to a table full of 20-somethings that I didn't really have hobbies or interests and spent most of my time just wandering around the house missing Mom. She painted a picture of me as a pathetic figure who needed her visits to feel useful, while simultaneously canceling those visits whenever something more interesting came along. When one of her friends asked about my career, Sarah responded with, "Oh, he did some kind of financial stuff. Nothing too exciting." 4 decades of building financial security for families, helping people retire comfortably, and managing investments that funded college educations and dream homes were reduced to nothing too exciting by the daughter who had benefited most from that expertise. Her tone wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was indifferent, the way you might describe a boring job held by someone you barely knew. The final stage of disrespect was Sarah's assumption that I would always be available for her convenience while she would never be available for mine. She called only when she needed something: advice about apartment hunting, help understanding insurance forms, someone to drive her to the airport at 5 a.m. because Uber was surge pricing. But when I called her, my ring went straight to voicemail that she might return 3 days later with a text saying, "Busy week, what's up?" The message was clear. My time had no value, but hers was precious and limited. Tonight's birthday disaster wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable climax of a relationship that had been deteriorating for years while I pretended not to notice. Sarah hadn't suddenly become disrespectful. She had been practicing disrespect so gradually that I had accepted each new level of dismissal as normal. Now, sitting in my office with her canceled credit card confirmation on my screen, I finally understood that ignoring warning signs doesn't make them disappear. It just makes the eventual crash more devastating. The evening started with hope that should have been my first warning sign. Sarah arrived 30 minutes late, which had become standard, but she arrived with 3 friends I had never met and hadn't known were invited. "Dad, you remember Jessica, right?" she said, gesturing toward a blonde woman who had clearly never set foot in my house before. "And this is Marcus and Zoe from work." They filed past me into the living room like they were attending a business function, each carrying bottles of wine I suspected they had picked up at the gas station during their drive over. None of them acknowledged the birthday decorations or the obvious effort I had put into creating a welcoming environment. Instead, they immediately began rearranging my carefully planned seating arrangement, pushing furniture around to create what Marcus called a better conversation flow. I watched my thoughtfully set dinner table become irrelevant as they settled into the living room with their wine and phones, treating my birthday celebration like a casual Tuesday evening gathering that happened to be occurring in a stranger's house. Sarah's attitude was different from the moment she walked in. There was an edge to her voice, an impatience in her movements that suggested she was already calculating how quickly she could make her exit. When I offered to take their coats, She waved me off dismissively.
"We're not staying that long, Dad. This is just a quick birthday thing." The phrase quick birthday thing hit me like a physical blow.
My 75th birthday had been reduced to an obligation she needed to check off her list before moving on to more important activities. When I asked if anyone wanted coffee or appetizers, Jessica, who had introduced herself as Sarah's work wife, laughed and said, "Oh God, no.
We're trying to save room for dinner later."
They were planning to eat somewhere else after leaving my birthday celebration. I had prepared a 3-course meal that would serve 8 people, and my daughter's friends were treating it like an inconvenience they needed to avoid. The photography class gift presentation became the first public humiliation of the evening. I had planned to wait until after dinner, but Sarah seemed so eager to leave that I decided to present it early, hoping it might change the mood. "Sarah, I have something special for you," I said, retrieving the elegantly wrapped frame from the side table. "I know you mentioned wanting to explore photography, so I enrolled you in a 6-month program with Michael Rodriguez downtown. He's supposed to be one of the best portrait photographers in the city." Sarah barely glanced at the enrollment certificate before setting it aside and turning to her friends. "My dad still thinks I'm going through my artistic phase," she announced, using air quotes that made my gift sound like a childish whim she had outgrown. "I told him I was interested in photography like 2 years ago."
"But it's sweet that he remembered, I guess."
The room fell silent in a way that made my humiliation even more acute. Her friends exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared discomfort with witnessing such casual cruelty. Marcus cleared his throat and mumbled something about the enrollment being really thoughtful, but Sarah had already moved on, asking Zoe about weekend plans that obviously didn't include spending any additional time with her father. The breaking point came when I asked if anyone wanted to sing "Happy Birthday" before cutting the cake I had selected so carefully. Sarah's response was swift and devastating. "Dad, that's kind of weird.
We're not 10 years old."
When I stood there holding the cake, uncertain whether to proceed, she looked directly at her friends and said the words that would replay in my mind for hours afterward. "This is why I don't visit more often. Dad, you're honestly kind of a burden sometimes. Like, we're adults. We don't need to do the whole birthday song thing. It's embarrassing." The word burden hung in the air like smoke from an explosion.
Jessica stared at her wine glass.
Marcus suddenly became fascinated by his phone screen. Zoe excused herself to use the bathroom, clearly desperate to escape the toxic atmosphere Sarah had just created. And I stood there holding a birthday cake covered in melted candles, being called a burden in my own living room by the daughter I had spent decades protecting from every possible hardship. But Sarah wasn't finished. As if sensing that her initial blow hadn't completely destroyed me, she continued, "I mean, I love you, Dad, but sometimes you make things so much more complicated than they need to be."
"Like, this whole dinner thing?"
"We could have just grabbed coffee somewhere. All this formal stuff just makes everyone uncomfortable." She gestured around the room I had spent hours preparing, dismissing my efforts as formal stuff that created problems rather than showing love. The irony was perfect and cruel. I was being called a burden by someone whose entire lifestyle I had been subsidizing for years. The daughter who had never paid for her own emergency, never solved her own financial crisis, never faced a single consequence of poor planning, was explaining to a room full of strangers that her father was the problem in their relationship. As her friends began making obvious preparations to leave, checking phones, mentioning other commitments, thanking me with a hollow politeness reserved for uncomfortable social situations, Sarah seemed oblivious to the damage she had caused. She hugged me goodbye with the casual affection you might show an elderly neighbor you see once a month, then walked out of my house discussing dinner reservations she had made for the group at a restaurant downtown. I stood in my empty living room, surrounded by untouched appetizers and wilted flowers, holding a birthday gift that had been dismissed as outdated thinking, listening to my daughter's voice fade as she led her friends toward evening plans that mattered more than celebrating the man who had made her lifestyle possible. For the first time in 8 years, I began to wonder what would happen if the burden she complained about suddenly disappeared from her life entirely. The silence that followed their departure was different from the comfortable quiet I had grown accustomed to during my 4 years of widowhood. This silence had weight, pressing down on the house like atmospheric pressure before a storm. I stood motionless in the doorway for several minutes, listening to Sarah's laughter fade as her group walked toward their cars, discussing which restaurant had the best cocktail menu at this hour. The sound of their engines starting and driving away marked the official end of my 75th birthday celebration, though the real celebration had ended the moment my daughter had chosen to weaponize her discomfort rather than simply excusing herself politely. Cleaning up became a meditation on waste and misplaced effort. The dining room table, set for 8 people with my finest china and Martha's silver candlesticks, looked like a stage set for a play that had been canceled after the first act. I carefully wrapped the untouched chicken marsala and stored it in containers that would feed me for the next week, each portion a reminder of how thoroughly I had misjudged my audience. The birthday cake, with its collapsed candles and perfect raspberry filling, went into the refrigerator whole, too elaborate to throw away, too painful to eat. The white roses I had arranged with such hope now seemed to mock my optimism, their perfect blooms witnessing the destruction of whatever illusion I had maintained about my relationship with Sarah. As I washed wine glasses that had barely been touched and folded napkins that had never left the table, I found myself replaying the evening's conversations with the analytical mind that had served me well in 4 decades of financial planning. The numbers, as they always did, told a story that emotions had obscured. Sarah had spent approximately 45 minutes in my house, during which she had dismissed my gift, insulted my efforts, humiliated me in front of strangers, and established that my presence in her life was fundamentally problematic. In exchange for this treatment, I had spent $340 on dinner ingredients, $180 on flowers and decorations, $2,400 on a photography course she would never attend, and countless hours creating an environment designed to make her feel celebrated and loved. The return on investment was devastating, but the real calculation was more complex and more painful. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the same room where Martha had spent her final weeks surrounded by family photos and the comfort of knowing our daughter would be cared for after she was gone. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pulled out the manila folder containing Sarah's credit card statements and spread them across Martha's side of the mattress. The numbers formed a pattern that told the story of a young woman living far beyond her means while remaining completely unaware of the financial foundation supporting her lifestyle. March, $4,200 in charges, including an $800 weekend in Charleston she had described on Instagram as much-needed self-care. April, $3,900, featuring a $600 spa day that she had justified as investing in mental health. May, $5,100, highlighted by a $1,400 shopping spree she had celebrated as treating myself for getting through a hard week. Each statement represented not just money spent, but opportunities one had sacrificed. The new roof I had postponed for 3 years while covering her emergency expenses. The vacation to visit my brother that I had canceled to pay for her car repairs. The hearing aids I needed but couldn't justify purchasing while maintaining her credit limit increases. I had been living like a man with limited resources while funding a daughter who behaved like someone with unlimited wealth. The cruelest irony was discovering a charge from earlier that evening. $180 at Chez Laurent, the upscale French restaurant where Sarah and her friends had gone after leaving my house. She had used my credit card to pay for the dinner that replaced my birthday celebration, spending more on one meal for 4 people than I typically spent on food in a month. While I sat alone with leftover chicken marsala, my daughter was toasting someone else's company with wine that appeared on my monthly statement. This wasn't financial support, it was financial abuse disguised as filial duty. The realization came not as anger but as clarity, the same kind of analytical precision that had made me successful in managing other people's money for 4 decades. I had been approaching the problem incorrectly, treating Sarah's behavior as a temporary phase that love and patience could resolve rather than recognizing it as the predictable result of a system that rewarded disrespect with increased funding. Martha's voice seemed to echo in the quiet bedroom, not the desperate whispers from her final days but the strong, clear guidance she had provided throughout our marriage when difficult decisions needed to be made. "Jean," she had said during our early years when money was tight and choices mattered. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their decisions. That's how people learn to make better choices. I had forgotten that wisdom in my grief, replacing Martha's practical love with my own misguided generosity. Tonight, Sarah had called me a burden while using my money to fund her social life, and I had finally understood the difference between supporting someone and enabling their worst impulses. The decision, when it came, felt less like revenge and more like surgery, painful but necessary to save what could still be saved of our relationship. I walked downstairs to my office, pulled out Sarah's credit card statements one more time, and reached for the phone. It was time to discover what my daughter was worth when she couldn't purchase her lifestyle with someone else's money. The next morning, I woke with the kind of clarity that usually follows difficult decisions made in darkness. There was no regret, no second-guessing, only the methodical planning that had served me well during 4 decades of managing complex financial situations for clients who needed decisive action rather than endless deliberation. Sarah's credit card cancellation was just the beginning of a larger educational process that would require careful orchestration to be truly effective. Over coffee and toast, I created a timeline that would ensure my daughter understood not just the immediate consequences of her behavior, but the full scope of what she had taken for granted. The first call went to Janet Morrison at First National Bank, where I had maintained my primary accounts for over 30 years. Janet had processed countless transactions for me, from Martha's medical expenses to the various property investments that Sarah never knew existed. "Mr. Patterson," Janet said warmly, recognizing my voice immediately. "How can I help you this morning?" I explained that I needed to restructure several automatic payments and remove an authorized user from multiple accounts. Janet, with the discretion that comes from years in private banking, asked no unnecessary questions and simply confirmed each change as I dictated it. Sarah's automatic rent payment, her car insurance, her gym membership, her Netflix subscription, all the invisible financial support that had kept her life running smoothly, would end simultaneously at midnight on Friday. The timing was strategic. Sarah's lifestyle would collapse over the weekend, when banks were closed and solutions were harder to find. My second call was to David Chen, the insurance agent who handled my automotive policies. Sarah's BMW was listed under my coverage as a family member, an arrangement that saved her roughly $200 monthly while providing premium protection she thought she was paying for herself. "I need to remove my daughter from my automotive policy effective this Friday," I told David. "She'll need to secure her own coverage immediately or risk driving uninsured." David, who had known our family since Sarah was in high school, paused before responding.
"Jenny, is everything all right?"
"This seems sudden." I appreciated his concern but kept my explanation simple. My daughter is ready to handle her own financial responsibilities. It's time she learned what independence actually costs. The third call required more delicate negotiation. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been Sarah's dentist for 15 years, ever since we moved to the city. More importantly, she had been billing me directly for Sarah's care rather than dealing with insurance complications that might create paperwork headaches for my daughter. Sarah's recent teeth cleaning, her crown replacement, and the cosmetic work she had requested last month had all been charged to my account automatically. "Dr. Martinez, I need to update our billing arrangement for Sarah's care," I explained. "Moving forward, she'll need to handle her own dental expenses and insurance coordination." Dr. Martinez, who had watched Sarah grow from teenager to adult, seemed to understand the implications immediately. "Of course, Mr. Patterson. Should I send her a summary of services and payment options for future appointments?" The suggestion was tactful and practical. Sarah would receive documentation of dental care that had cost me $3,400 over the past year, itemized proof of yet another expense she had never considered. The fourth call was perhaps the most challenging because it involved dismantling arrangements that had taken years to establish. Michael Rodriguez, the photography instructor whose course I had prepaid for Sarah's birthday gift, listened patiently as I explained that my daughter would not be attending the program after all. "I understand these situations can be complicated, Mr. Patterson," Michael said diplomatically. "Would you like me to refund the tuition, or should I hold the spot in case she changes her mind?" I chose the refund, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted no financial entanglements remaining between my resources and Sarah's choices. Every connection needed to be severed cleanly so that her upcoming education in self-reliance would be complete and unambiguous. By noon, I had contacted 7 different service providers, financial institutions, and professional offices. Each conversation was brief, professional, and irreversible. Sarah's safety net wasn't just being removed, it was being systematically dismantled by the same methodical approach I had used to build it in the first place. The final preparation was psychological rather than financial. I drafted a letter that I would never send, explaining my decision in detail, outlining every expense I had covered, and articulating the distinction between love and enablement. Writing the letter helped clarify my own thinking, even though Sarah would need to discover these lessons through experience rather than explanation. Words had failed us repeatedly. Consequences would succeed where conversations had not. I spent the afternoon organizing documentation that Sarah might need during her transition to financial independence. Contact information for insurance agents, account numbers for utilities, names of reliable mechanics and service providers. I wasn't abandoning my daughter. I was forcing her to engage with responsibilities she had ignored while I handled them invisibly. The difference was crucial and would determine whether this intervention taught valuable lessons or simply created resentment. As evening approached, I found myself oddly peaceful about the chaos that would begin unfolding in Sarah's life within 48 hours. She had called me a burden while benefiting from arrangements that most people her age could only dream of accessing. Friday night, she would discover what life looked like when the burden she complained about stopped carrying her weight. The education was about to begin, and for the first time in years, I was confident that Martha would approve of the lesson I was finally ready to teach. Friday arrived with the quiet finality of an execution date. All morning, I went through my normal routine: coffee at 6, newspaper by 7, gentle exercises that kept my 75-year-old body functional, while knowing that at exactly midnight, Sarah's financial world would collapse with the precision of a controlled demolition. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending my last day as her invisible benefactor doing the same mundane activities that had filled thousands of previous days when she considered me nothing more than a harmless inconvenience. At 2:30 p.m., I received the first confirmation email from American Express. Account modification completed. Authorized user Sarah Patterson has been removed from account ending in 4827. All cards associated with this user have been deactivated. The language was clinical, but the implications were massive. Sarah's primary credit card, the financial lifeline she used for everything from groceries to emergency expenses, would be declined the next time she tried to use it. She had no idea that her evening plans depended on plastic that would soon become worthless decoration for her wallet. The second wave of confirmations arrived between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m. First National Bank confirmed the cancellation of automatic payments for Sarah's rent, car insurance, and monthly subscriptions. Mutual Insurance verified the removal of Sarah from my automotive policy, effective at midnight. Pacific Dental Group acknowledged the change in billing arrangements that would make Sarah responsible for her own dental expenses going forward. Each email felt like claiming territory that had been occupied for too long by someone who had never appreciated its value. By 5 p.m., I had received 14 separate confirmations of changes that would transform Sarah's life from subsidized comfort to unassisted reality. The cumulative effect was staggering even to me, and I had been the architect of every arrangement being dismantled.
Rent assistance, $2,800 monthly.
Car insurance subsidy, $240 monthly. Credit card payments, averaging $4,000 monthly. Dental coverage, $280 monthly. Various subscriptions and services, $180 monthly. The total monthly support I had been providing invisibly amounted to $7,500, more than twice Sarah's actual salary from her part-time job at the marketing agency. She had been living like someone earning $90,000 annually while making less than $40,000, and the difference had been coming from a father she called a burden. The final confirmation was the most symbolic. Michael Rodriguez, the photography instructor, sent a personal note along with the refund documentation. "Mr. Patterson, I've processed the $2,400 refund for Sarah's photography course. I hope she finds an opportunity to pursue her artistic interests when the timing is better. Thank you for thinking of my program for her development." The politeness of his message highlighted how completely Sarah had dismissed the gift, treating a significant investment in her creative growth as an outdated gesture from a father who didn't understand her current interests. As evening approached, I found myself checking my phone with the anticipation usually reserved for major life events. Sarah was probably getting ready for another weekend of expensive socializing, completely unaware that her last hurrah as a financially subsidized adult was about to begin. She would likely start the evening with dinner somewhere trendy, move on to cocktails at whatever rooftop bar was currently popular, and end the night making impulsive purchases that seemed affordable when someone else was ultimately responsible for the bills. Saturday morning would bring the first shock when her credit card was declined at her favorite coffee shop. The rent crisis would hit on Monday when her landlord informed her that the automatic payment had failed. The insurance revelation would come Tuesday when she tried to file a claim for the minor fender bender that seemed statistically inevitable given her casual approach to responsibility. Each discovery would force her to confront a different aspect of the financial architecture that had been supporting her lifestyle without her knowledge or gratitude. The most profound change wasn't financial, it was psychological. For 8 years, Sarah had lived with the unconscious confidence that comes from knowing someone else will handle life's major problems. Bills might arrive, but they would be paid. Emergencies might occur, but resources would appear. Consequences might threaten, but solutions would materialize from nowhere. That safety net had allowed her to develop the kind of casual arrogance toward money and responsibility that only exists when you've never actually faced either directly. Starting tomorrow, Sarah would discover what life felt like when your decisions had permanent consequences and your mistakes couldn't be erased by someone else's checkbook. The education would be comprehensive and unforgiving, covering everything from basic budgeting to insurance navigation to the real cost of independence. For the first time since Martha's death, I felt like I was honoring my wife's actual wishes rather than my misinterpretation of them. Martha had wanted Sarah to grow strong through challenge, not weak through protection. Beginning at midnight, my daughter would finally have the opportunity to develop the character her mother had always believed she possessed. The burden she had complained was about to disappear completely, and she would discover whether she was strong enough to carry her own weight. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy for Sarah, who woke at 11:30 a.m. with a mild headache that had become her standard weekend greeting after Friday night socializing. Her apartment looked exactly as she had left it, designer clothes draped over furniture that someone else had helped her afford, empty wine glasses from a pre-dinner gathering with friends who had no idea their hostess lived entirely on borrowed prosperity. She moved through her usual weekend routine with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never questioned where money came from, only where it went. The first crack in her reality appeared at Brew and Bean, the upscale coffee shop where Sarah performed her weekend ritual of spending $18 on a specialty latte and organic pastry while catching up on social media. She handed her platinum card to the barista with the casual authority of someone accustomed to frictionless transactions, already planning her Instagram post about Saturday morning self-care. The card reader's response was immediate and devastating. Declined. "That's weird," Sarah muttered, assuming the problem was technical.
Can you try it again?
The barista, a college student who recognized Sarah as a regular customer, swiped the card a second time with careful attention to the magnetic strip. Declined. The line behind Sarah began to shift restlessly as she fumbled through her wallet, searching for an alternative payment method that didn't exist. She had carried only the platinum card for months, confident in its unlimited reliability. Her checking account contained exactly $340, enough for groceries if she shopped carefully, but nowhere near sufficient for her typical weekend expenses. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, her voice carrying the first note of genuine panic.
Something must be wrong with your machine.
I'll just come back later. She fled the coffee shop without her usual latte, her morning routine shattered by a two-word message she had never seen before. The walk home became an exercise in denial and rationalization. Credit cards malfunctioned occasionally. Everyone knew that. The magnetic strip might be damaged, or the bank might be experiencing technical difficulties. There were logical explanations that didn't require confronting any fundamental changes in her financial situation. She would call customer service, sort out the confusion, and laugh about the inconvenience later when she told her friends about the crazy glitch that had temporarily disrupted her Saturday plans. The customer service call destroyed any remaining illusion of a simple technical error. After navigating through automated menus and waiting 12 minutes on hold, Sarah finally reached a human representative who delivered the news with professional courtesy. "Ms. Patterson, I show that your authorized user status on this account was terminated on Friday evening at the request of the primary account holder. Your card access has been permanently revoked."
The words "it Sarah like a physical blow."
"That's impossible," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "There must be some mistake. I need to speak to a supervisor immediately." The supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had clearly handled similar situations before, confirmed the devastating reality with additional details that made the situation worse. Ms. Patterson, the primary account holder, Eugene Patterson, specifically requested the immediate cancellation of all authorized user privileges. This action is irreversible and was processed according to his explicit instructions. If you have questions about this decision, you'll need to contact Mr. Patterson directly. Sarah ended the call and immediately dialed my number, her fingers trembling with a combination of rage and desperation. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, my voice delivering the standard greeting she had heard hundreds of times. "You've reached Gene Patterson. Please leave a message and I'll return your call as soon as possible." The sound of my calm, familiar voice triggered an explosion of emotions Sarah had never been forced to confront simultaneously.
How dare I cancel her card without warning?
What gave me the right to sabotage her weekend plans? Didn't I understand that she had obligations and expenses that depended on that credit line? Her second call went to voicemail as well, followed by a third and fourth attempt that produced the same result. I wasn't answering, which felt like deliberate cruelty rather than simple unavailability. Sarah left increasingly frantic messages, her tone evolving from confused inquiry to angry demand to desperate pleading over the course of 20 minutes. "Dad, I don't know what happened with my credit card, but I need you to call me back immediately. This is really serious. Dad, pick up your phone. I know you're there. Whatever's going on with the card, we need to fix it right now. I have plans today."
Dad, please.
"I'm sorry if I upset you the other night, but this isn't fair. You can't just cut me off without explaining what's happening."
Call me back.
By noon, Sarah was forced to confront a reality she had never imagined. She was essentially broke, stranded in an expensive city with no access to the financial resources that had always appeared automatically when she needed them. Her rent was due Monday, her refrigerator was empty, and her tank was running low on gas she couldn't afford to replace. For the first time in her adult life, my daughter was about to discover what financial independence actually meant when you had never learned to be financially responsible. Sunday afternoon brought the confrontation I had been expecting since Friday night. Sarah arrived at my house unannounced, her usual confident stride replaced by the urgent, slightly desperate movements of someone whose world had been quietly rearranged without her permission. She used her key, a privilege I hadn't yet revoked, and found me in the kitchen, calmly reading the newspaper over a cup of coffee as if the past 48 hours had been perfectly ordinary. The contrast between my serenity and her obvious distress set the tone for what would become the most honest conversation we had shared in years. "Dad, we need to talk. Right now." Sarah's voice carried an edge I had never heard before, part anger and part something that sounded uncomfortably close to fear. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair uncombed, her makeup smudged in a way that suggested she had spent the weekend dealing with problems instead of enjoying her usual social activities. "Of course," I said, folding the newspaper with deliberate calm. "Would you like some coffee?" The offer seemed to enrage her further. "I don't want coffee. I want to know why you sabotaged my life without even telling me. My credit card has been canceled, Dad. Do you understand what that means? I couldn't buy groceries yesterday. I had to cancel dinner with my friends because I can't pay for anything."
This is insane.
I studied my daughter's face, noting the red-rimmed eyes and the slightly frantic energy that comes from spending 2 days trying to solve an unsolvable problem with insufficient resources.
I didn't sabotage your life, Sarah.
I removed my financial support from it. "There's a significant difference." "What are you talking about?" she demanded.
It's my credit card.
"I've been using it for years. You can't just take it away because you're mad about some stupid birthday drama." The conversation had reached the moment I had been preparing for since Friday. Sarah genuinely believed the credit card was hers, that the lifestyle she had been living was something she had earned and maintained independently. The depth of her financial ignorance was both shocking and predictable. "Sarah, sit down," I said quietly. "You need to understand something important about that credit card and your life in general." She remained standing, arms crossed, radiating the kind of defensive anger that comes from feeling cornered. "I don't need to understand anything except how to get my card back. Just call them and fix this." Instead of arguing, I walked to my office and returned with a manila folder containing documentation I had never intended to show her. The monthly statements, payment confirmations, and financial summaries that told the story of her actual relationship with money. I spread the papers across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial where she was both defendant and jury. "This is your credit card activity for the past 12 months, I said, pointing to the American Express statements. "Total charges, $51,400. Total payments made by you, $0. Total payments made by me, $51,400. Sarah's eyes moved across the numbers with the confusion of someone trying to read a foreign language. "That's not right," she said, but her voice had lost its aggressive certainty. "I pay my credit card bill every month. It comes out of my checking account automatically." "No, Sarah. It comes out of my checking account automatically. It has for 8 years. I pulled out the bank statements showing automatic transfers from my account to American Express. You've never made a single payment on this card. Not one." The color drained from her face as she processed this information. But I get statements. I see the payments being made."
Ito.
Her voice trailed off as she realized she had never actually looked at where those payments originated, only that they appeared to happen without her intervention. "You assumed," I said gently. "And I allowed you to assume because I thought I was helping you get established. But getting established means learning to support yourself, not learning to take support for granted." I continued laying out documents that revealed the full scope of her financial dependence.
Your car insurance, $240 monthly, paid by me.
Your rent, $2,800 monthly, covered by automatic transfer from my account. Your gym membership, Netflix, Spotify, Adobe Creative Suite, all paid through my credit cards. With each revelation, Sarah's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something approaching horror. "Dad, I had no idea."
Ito.
"I mean, I knew you helped sometimes, but I didn't know it was." "Everything," I finished. "I was paying for everything while you convinced yourself you were independent. Last month alone, I covered $7,200 in expenses you charged to various accounts. Your actual salary is $3,200 monthly. You've been living on more than double your income for years." The silence that followed was unlike any we had shared before. Sarah stared at the papers spread across the table, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up statement after statement, seeing her lifestyle documented in numbers that told a story completely different from the one she had been telling herself. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "I asked you the same question after you called me a burden in front of your friends," I replied. "Why didn't you tell me you had no idea where your money actually came from? Why didn't you ask how a part-time marketing assistant could afford a lifestyle that requires $90,000 in annual income?" Sarah looked up from the statements, and for the first time in years, I saw my daughter rather than the entitled stranger she had become.
"Dad, I'm so sorry."
"I didn't know. I honestly didn't understand." "I know you didn't," I said softly. "And that's exactly the problem I'm trying to solve." Sarah's apology hung in the air between us, genuine but incomplete. She was sorry for not knowing about the credit cards and monthly payments, but she still had no idea about the true scope of what she had taken for granted or the man she had been dismissing as a burden. The documents spread across the kitchen table told only part of the story, the part about her expenses. What they didn't reveal was the source of my ability to absorb those expenses without apparent strain, or why a man she assumed lived on Social Security could casually cover $90,000 in annual lifestyle costs for someone else. "Sarah," I said, standing up from the table, "there's something else you need to understand about your father before you can truly grasp what's been happening here." I led her into my office, the room she had walked past hundreds of times without ever showing curiosity about its contents. Sarah stepped inside and stopped abruptly, her eyes scanning the space with the dawning realization that nothing was what she had assumed. 3 large monitors displayed real-time financial data. A conference phone sat beside stacks of investment statements. The walls were lined with framed certificates, awards, and photographs that told the story of a career she had dismissed as some boring financial stuff. "Dad, what is all this?" she asked, moving closer to examine a plaque from the Pennsylvania Investment Management Association recognizing 40 years of outstanding service. Next to it hung a photograph of me shaking hands with the governor at an economic development ceremony. "This is what I did before I retired," I said, pulling out a chair so she could sit down. "And this is what I've continued doing since retirement, though on a smaller scale." I opened the filing cabinet and retrieved a leather portfolio containing documentation that would shatter whatever remaining assumptions Sarah held about my financial situation. Patterson Investment Management handled over $200 million in client assets when I sold the firm 5 years ago. I kept approximately $12 million in personal holdings, along with a commercial real estate portfolio that generates substantial monthly income. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The numbers I was sharing existed in a realm she had never imagined, let alone connected to the man she had been treating as a lonely old widower who needed her occasional visits to feel useful. "You own $12 million?" she whispered. "In liquid investments, yes. The real estate holdings are separate and significantly more valuable." I spread out property deeds and income statements that documented my actual financial position. I own 17 rental properties throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, including 4 apartment complexes and 2 small shopping centers. Monthly rental income averages $47,000, though it varies seasonally. The revelation was devastating Sarah's entire understanding of our family dynamics. "$47,000 per month?" she repeated, as if saying the numbers aloud might make them less shocking. "That's more than I make in a year." "Significantly more," I confirmed. "Which is why covering your $7,500 monthly expenses never presented a financial hardship for me. The problem wasn't that I couldn't afford to support your lifestyle. The problem was that supporting it was preventing you from developing your own." I pulled out additional documents that showed the full scope of my holdings: stock portfolios, municipal bonds, treasury certificates, and business partnerships that had been generating wealth for decades while Sarah assumed I was living on a fixed income. "The photography course I bought you for your birthday cost $2,400. I earned that amount in rental income approximately every 36 hours. The car insurance I've been paying costs $240 monthly. I generate that much in investment income every 4 hours. Each comparison was designed to help Sarah understand not just the magnitude of my resources, but the complete irrelevance of her expenses to my overall financial picture. I had been covering her lifestyle costs with less than 0.1% of my monthly income, while she had been treating those costs as evidence of my need to feel useful. The cruelest irony, I continued, is that you called me a burden while I was supporting you at a level that would be impossible for most parents. You were living like the daughter of a wealthy man while treating me like a poor old man who needed your pity. Sarah stared at the documents scattered across my desk, her worldview collapsing with each new piece of evidence. Dad, I had no idea. You live so simply. You clip coupons. You drive that old Honda. You never talked about money or business or... Because I learned early in my career that wealth is best managed quietly, I said. And because your mother and I raised you to value character over possessions. We wanted you to develop strength and independence, not entitlement and dependence. I showed her photographs from my business years, award ceremonies, client appreciation events, newspaper articles about major deals I had orchestrated. I spent 4 decades helping families plan for financial security. I built wealth not to impress anyone, but to ensure that you and your mother would never face the kind of hardship I grew up with. The final revelation was perhaps the most painful for Sarah to process. The house you dismissed as the boring place where your sad old father lived alone? It's worth $1.2 million and has been mortgage-free for 15 years. The car I drive was paid for in cash. The groceries I buy with coupons are purchased that way by choice, not necessity. Everything you thought you knew about my financial situation was exactly backwards. Sarah buried her face in her hands, and when she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears that seemed to contain every emotion she was capable of experiencing simultaneously.
Dad, I'm so sorry.
I'm so incredibly sorry. I don't understand how I got everything so wrong. You got it wrong, I said gently, because I allowed you to get it wrong. I enabled your assumptions because I thought I was protecting you. But I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself from the difficult conversations that real parenting requires. The education was nearly complete. Sarah now understood both the scope of her dependence and the magnitude of resources that had been supporting her unconsciously entitled lifestyle. The only question remaining was whether this knowledge would create wisdom or merely resentment. The weeks that followed our confrontation transformed Sarah in ways that surprised both of us. The change wasn't immediate. Real growth never is, but it was unmistakable and profound. For the first time since childhood, my daughter was forced to engage with reality rather than simply expecting reality to accommodate her preferences. The education was thorough and, at times, painful for both of us to witness. Sarah's first challenge was basic survival with a $3,200 monthly salary and no external support. She moved out of her expensive downtown loft within 2 weeks, finding a studio apartment in a neighborhood she had previously considered too boring for someone of her social aspirations. The new place cost $1,400 monthly, still a significant portion of her income, but manageable with careful budgeting. I watched from a distance as she sold furniture, canceled subscriptions, and made the 1,000 small compromises that constitute actual financial responsibility. The BMW was the most symbolic surrender. Sarah spent 3 days researching used car values, negotiating with dealers, and discovering that the vehicle she had considered hers was worth significantly less than the remaining loan balance. She called me twice during the process, not asking for money but seeking advice about depreciation, financing terms, and insurance costs, conversations we had never had because I had always handled such matters invisibly. "Dad," she said during one of these calls, "I'm starting to realize how much I didn't know about anything." She eventually traded down to a 5-year-old Honda Civic, making the same choice I had made 40 years earlier when building my own financial foundation. Employment became Sarah's second education. Her part-time position at the marketing agency, which had been perfectly adequate when someone else covered major expenses, suddenly became insufficient for supporting an independent adult lifestyle. She asked her supervisor for additional responsibilities and longer hours, volunteering for projects she had previously avoided because they required weekend work or early morning meetings. When the agency couldn't offer full-time status, Sarah found freelance graphic design work that she completed during evenings and weekends. I learned about her expanded work schedule not from direct communication but from observing the changes in her availability and energy during our gradually increasing contact. She was working 50-hour weeks and looked tired in a way that was completely different from the exhaustion that comes from late-night socializing. This was the productive fatigue that results from genuine effort, and it suited her better than I had expected. The social adjustments were perhaps the most revealing. Sarah's friend group underwent natural selection as her lifestyle changed from subsidized luxury to earned modesty. Some friends drifted away when she could no longer afford to participate in expensive group activities. Others proved more adaptable, suggesting lower-cost alternatives or simply enjoying her company regardless of the venue. "I'm finding out who my real friends are," she told me during one of our monthly dinners, which had resumed on her initiative. "Turns out there weren't as many as I thought." Our own relationship evolved through a series of small, deliberate steps. Sarah began calling me weekly, not to request assistance but to share updates about her life and ask questions about topics she was encountering for the first time. "How do you negotiate with insurance companies? What's the difference between different types of retirement accounts? How do you evaluate whether a freelance project is worth the time investment?" These conversations revealed a curiosity about practical matters that had been dormant as long as someone else handled all practical concerns. 3 months after our confrontation, Sarah made a request that surprised me completely. "Dad, would you teach me about investing? Not so you can manage my money, but so I can learn to manage it myself." We began meeting twice monthly for what she called financial literacy sessions, during which I explained concepts that most people her age had been learning for years through necessity. Compound interest, tax strategies, emergency fund planning, career development as investment in human capital. Topics that became fascinating to someone who had never needed to consider them before. The most significant change was how Sarah began referring to our relationship when talking to others. I overheard her on a phone call with a friend, describing me not as the lonely old man who needed her occasional company, but as my dad, who's teaching me how to be an adult for the first time. The shift from burden to mentor happened gradually, but hearing her acknowledge my value rather than dismiss it felt like watching a broken bone finally heal properly. 6 months after canceling her credit card, I received a text message that contained 8 words I had never expected to see: "Thank you for forcing me to grow up." The message was accompanied by a photograph of her first emergency fund statement. $1,200 she had saved entirely through her own efforts, money that belonged to her in a way that none of my financial support ever had. Sarah was discovering what Martha had always wanted her to experience: the satisfaction that comes from solving your own problems and the confidence that develops when you realize you're stronger than you thought. The daughter who had called me a burden was learning to carry her own weight, and in doing so, she was becoming the woman her mother had always believed she could be. 1 year later, Sarah and I celebrated my 76th birthday in a way that would have been unimaginable during the disaster that had occurred 12 months earlier. She arrived at my house carrying a homemade chocolate cake, not store-bought, but actually baked in her own kitchen using a recipe she had asked Martha's sister to teach her. The gesture was small but profound. My daughter had invested time and effort into creating something specifically for my celebration, rather than treating my birthday as an obligation to endure or an opportunity to showcase her own social life. We sat together at the same dining room table where she had once dismissed my photography course gift, but this time we were truly present with each other, having conversations that mattered rather than simply occupying the same space while focused on separate agendas. "Dad," Sarah said as we finished dinner, "I need to tell you something important. Canceling my credit card was the best thing you ever did for me, even though I hated you for it at the time." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I know you could have kept supporting me forever. You had the money, and you wanted to help. But helping me wasn't the same thing as helping me grow up. The conversation that followed revealed how completely our relationship had transformed. Sarah described the satisfaction she felt when paying her bills entirely with money she had earned herself, the confidence that came from solving problems without external rescue, and the pride that developed when she realized she was capable of more than she had ever attempted while someone else was handling her responsibilities. "I understand now why you lived so simply despite having so much," she said. "You were trying to teach me values that money can't buy. I just wasn't ready to learn them until I had to." What struck me most was how Sarah's personal growth had affected every aspect of her life. Her work ethic had impressed her supervisors enough to offer her a full-time position with benefits and real advancement opportunities. Her friendships had become more genuine now that they were based on mutual interest rather than her ability to finance expensive group activities. Even her romantic relationships had improved, she told me, because she was no longer attracted to men who wanted to be taken care of, nor was she expecting to be taken care of herself. The most significant change was how Sarah had begun applying the lessons of self-reliance to help others. She volunteered as a financial literacy mentor for young women transitioning out of foster care, teaching basic budgeting and independent skills to people who had never had anyone to depend on in the first place. "I realized I had been living like someone who won the lottery without ever buying a ticket," she explained. "These women are starting with nothing and building everything themselves. They're stronger at 18 than I was at 28. Our story, I realized, wasn't unique in its details but universal in its themes. Every family struggles with the balance between support and enablement, between love and boundaries, between protecting children and preparing them for reality. The difference between helping someone and helping them grow often becomes clear only in retrospect, when the consequences of those choices reveal themselves in the character of the people we've raised." Sarah's transformation reminded me that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to solve problems that children need to solve themselves. The generation that fought through the Depression and World War II understood this instinctively. They knew that strength comes from overcoming obstacles, not from having obstacles removed.
Somewhere along the way, many of Stati Uniti forgot that lesson, mistaking comfort for kindness and protection for love.
What I learned during this experience is that entitled behavior isn't born from malice but from ignorance. Sarah hadn't deliberately chosen to become someone who took generosity for granted. She had simply never been forced to understand where that generosity came from or what it cost the person providing it. When she called me a burden, she genuinely believed that her presence in my life was a gift she was giving to a lonely old man, because that's the story our dynamic had taught her to believe. The most important lesson from our experience is that financial support and emotional support are completely different things, though they're often confused in family relationships. Children need to know they're loved unconditionally, but they also need to learn that lifestyle choices have consequences and that independence is earned through responsibility, not granted through entitlement. The balance between those two truths requires wisdom, patience, and sometimes the courage to allow people you love to struggle with challenges they need to overcome for themselves. As I reflect on this past year, I'm grateful for Martha's wisdom in encouraging me to let Sarah grow strong through difficulty rather than weak through excessive protection. The daughter who once called me a burden has become a woman who understands the value of both giving and receiving help appropriately. She's learned to carry her own weight while also appreciating the foundation that made her journey possible. If this story made you think about the people who sacrifice for you in silence, leave me a comment about your own experience with family boundaries. Don't forget to subscribe because this old father has many more hard-learned lessons to share.